What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some games that you can enjoy for hundreds of hours for less than $10. So very recently the Steam Summer Sale kicked off, and as always I like to do videos covering those sales, and in my case at least what I typically focus on is like new games that are just going on sale for the first time, or games that you can get for cheap to check out a franchise before an upcoming release. That way it's all sort of relevant, and those videos have always done very well for me. It's why I continue to make them. I also kind of enjoy making them, and people seem to enjoy watching them, so it's a win-win for everybody around. But on this last one that I did, somebody mentioned in the comments that they would be curious to get some recommendations of games that were less than $10, and I took it upon myself to take that a little farther, with the absolute maximum value possible being that these are games that are good that you could play for, again, potentially hundreds of hours. So, in fact, I've played most of these games for at least more than 100 hours, much more in some cases, but ultimately I'm kind of throwing this out here to see how this does. Maybe if it does well, I'll continue to do it for like future sales, but probably as an integration into the main video. I don't plan on breaking them up every time, that would be silly, but every once in a while it's fun to try something different out and see how it winds up panning out. With no further ado though, let's go ahead and dive into it. So first up we have Hades. The original one, that is. So Hades 2 is currently in early access, and having played it a fair bit for myself, and also having played the original, for the most part I would consider them just sort of like alternative versions of more or less the same thing. That is to say, I would play each of them for very distinct reasons because of how each of their main characters plays very differently. For instance, there are things that I think Zagreus is much more fun to engage with as opposed to Melanoy. I can never pronounce her name correctly. So even though there is that sequel in early access, I think there's still plenty of reason to play the original. And considering you can, during the sale, pick it up for $8.50 at a whopping 66% off, it's quite the experience for that incredibly small price. One of the things I enjoy most about Hades, though, is that roguelikes tend to feel very, very samey after a while. And, that is even true in cases like Hades, because you're running through a lot of the same content, ultimately. But what Hades does really, really well is it brings just a level of reactivity to the dialogue and interactions with the characters you'll meet or not meet along the way, that it feels fresh every time you're making it into a run. So there's this big narrative element that fully leans into the overall process that I think a lot of other roguelikes don't nail to nearly as much of a degree, which is why I think it's so great. But considering all of the different runs you'll need just to see the sort of true ending, not to mention all the upgrades, all the variations on the equipment and gameplay styles, it's a game you could easily sink hundreds of hours into, especially if you try to play it on the go, as it's the type of game, due to its roguelike nature, that I think fits in really well on like a lunch break as an example. But plenty of more to go, because the next one I want to mention is actually the original Nioh, which is itself $7.50 right now, coming in at 85% off during this sale. The reason I wanted to mention this one was the relatively recent announcement of the upcoming Nioh 3 due out in 2026. So if you've never played Nioh and only heard of it, now is a really great time to jump into the original. And while I think the second one brings in a lot of fun gameplay changes as well, much like with Hades, Nioh 1 and Nioh 2 have very specific things about the combat system that change that I think kind of make them alternative versions more so than just like straight improvements. Now, just as a note though, if you're going to play this on PC, it is strongly recommended that you use a controller, because the button displays are actually hard-coded. So you can remap stuff on a keyboard, but it will always display controller icons, which can get annoying, frankly. Though, seeing how most people play these games with a controller anyway, and I'm the weird one in that regard, it's probably not going to be a big deal. The Nioh series really, though, has just incredible combat across the board, and that is pretty much the single reason it is my favorite game series from Team Ninja. I really enjoyed both Nioh and Nioh 2. Combine that with the sort of Diablo-esque loot system that they've been using for a lot of their games, and you have a system where you are engaged in this really deep combat system with all these variations and everything, combining it with loot to make better and better builds as you move through the game's mission-based content. And the catch to that is, with all the updates and everything since release, you can ultimately play through those missions on an increasing difficulty scale from the original version up to, I think it's like New Game Plus 4, which is called Way of the Nioh. So plenty of things to do just then, but that's not even everything, because there is a sort of endless dungeon mode as well, or, technically endless. or at least in name. It does technically have an end, but it is extremely long, and thus you have a lot of content and trials to engage with that combat system, which I think is really the depth of Nioh that not a lot of other games offer comparatively. So while just running through all of the various difficulty levels is probably going to take you over 100 hours simply by itself, you could get even more time with this game if you wanted to take on those endless trials, which would almost certainly give you a pretty good idea of what Nioh was all about from the very beginning before the eventual release of Nioh 3. Our next title, though, is a TRPG via Troubleshooter, Abandoned Children. So if you've watched any of my TRPG videos or just my review for this game, you might just be aware that I consider this a must-play of the TRPG genre. Despite it being an indie title, it is incredibly good. The story's a little whatever, to be honest, but as far as the tactics and all of the mechanics and everything that go into it, just the sheer variety alone, it is absolutely worth it. But I do have to admit, I am cheating slightly here, as the base game is 70% off, bringing it down to $7.50, but if you buy all of the DLC, it comes in at a bit more than that. But realistically, there's only one DLC you'd actually need to buy, as the rest are just outfits, really, and that is the Crimson Crow. There is technically another DLC, but that one was just released as a free update. But the base game plus the Crimson Crow DLC, which again would be the one you would want to buy, brings it up to like $10.50. So, sue me, I guess. But simply put, if you like TRPGs, tactical turn-based games, then this game really is something you are doing yourself a disservice to have not played, and getting it for that little of a price is nothing. You can easily get lost for a couple hundred hours in here if you really wanted to. Keeping it moving with another favorite of mine, we've then got Divinity Original Sin. Not 2, but rather the first Original Sin, which is 80% off, bringing it down to $8, and that is with everything included, as Larian has not typically done like big DLCs and stuff. They've done some free updates for a few games here and there, but for Original Sin, $8 will get you the whole thing. Now, some people might not know this at this point, but there was a time in this channel's history, back when I had like less than 5,000 subscribers, where covering Divinity lore was like my big thing. I love that universe. I think it's great all on its own, mostly because of Larian's really reactive way of approaching player actions. Rather than just making sure you can't do things, they find a way to not only let you do them, but also give you a subtle nod while they're at it. And I think it's what makes a lot of their newer games, especially Original Sin 2, and like BG3 as an example, so much fun to engage with. And it's really no surprise then that they've had so much success with that. Prior to Original Sin, however, and their Kickstarters that have kind of leaned into that, they were doing a lot of just really odd stuff. And Original Sin is really when people started to take notice of them as a big studio. They'd already had a lot of prior experience doing other things, but Original Sin is where people started taking proper note, I would say, at a pretty big scale anyways. And in fact, to this day, Original Sin, I think, does one thing better than pretty much anything else Larian has done, besides maybe Divine Divinity, which is that all of its maps together feel like a proper explorable world that you can traverse at your leisure. And while there definitely is like a sort of recommended way to go through it, just due to things like levels and how difficult enemies will be, of course, it does feel a little more open than a lot of their subsequent work that came after this. And in fact, I think if you want to get a really good idea of Larian as a studio, then Original Sin is great to play, if only for that reason. But also, it's a lot of fun. There's a variety of outcomes to all sorts of stuff. It features my favorite Divinity character, Jahan, which is actually where I picked up my sign-off from back when I covered Divinity lore almost exclusively. And while it doesn't get talked about too much anymore, Original Sin can easily keep you occupied for hundreds of hours, and it is incredibly fun. So if you want to check out some of Larian's work on the cheap, it's definitely a really good way to do that. Speaking of CRPGs, though, I've got a couple more to talk about here. First up, we've got Pillars of Eternity 1. You can pick up the complete edition with all of its DLC for 75% off, bringing it down to $9.99, or $10 basically. The original Pillars of Eternity sort of rode that initial Kickstarter wave that itself ironically sort of kickstarted the CRPG renaissance that eventually led to Baldur's Gate 3 as an example. So purely just from a sort of historical standpoint, I think Pillars of Eternity will always be especially interesting just on that alone. It also just happens to be a really good CRPG, but I admit this one, especially compared to even its sequel, Deadfire, can be a little dry. There's a lot of reading involved, which is not something I personally care about, but what I mean in that context with this game is that Kickstarter actually is what caused them to put in a bunch of like backer characters, which are these NPCs with just giant heaps of exposition that don't actually have anything to do with much of the game at all, which certainly can get a little annoying. But there is actually a different reason I wanted to bring up this one, and that is that it was announced earlier this year that Pillars of Eternity, the original one, will in fact be getting a turn-based mode later this year, because while it is a real-time with pause experience right now, you can play it via turn-based, which will hopefully allow more people to experience how cool this setting and world is, which will hopefully then push them on to Deadfire, and maybe that will be enough of the secret sauce that they need to greenlight a Pillars of Eternity 3, which is a pipe dream of mine. But between the incredible story, the really great DLC via the White March, the stronghold system, etc., you will be making a proper mark on Eora that, if you want to see everything, can easily take up a couple of 100 hours, even if this one does require a bit more of an investment on your end. Speaking of investments, though, we have another one where I admit I am cheating slightly, because the base game for Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous is at 65% off, bringing it all the way down to $7. Now, technically speaking, with the DLC, it is actually $22.50. But the reason I decided to include this anyway is that Wrath of the Righteous took a very kind of odd stance with its DLC. Most of them are standalone and don't actually add much to the base game anyway, so you can get the full base game experience without most of them. The exception to that being A Dance of Mask, which is a sort of Citadel-esque DLC designed to sort of wrap things up, as well as the Last Sarkorians, which adds a companion and some content to the base game. Treasure of the Midnight Isles technically adds a big dungeon to the base game as well, but its sort of big draw is its sort of infinite roguelike dungeon mode that it adds as a standalone thing. But here's the thing, if you are playing Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous for the first time, I would actually recommend you just buy the base game and see if it's for you or not, because one thing I'll often talk about, despite this being my favorite game, is that it has a very high barrier to entry. There is so much to know. However, if you are willing to get over that hurdle, this is easily a game you could play for thousands of hours, not just hundreds. In fact, I personally have almost 900 hours in it, if you include my time with like the beta version way back in the day, as I've been covering this game extensively. It's one of the ones that kind of got my foot into the YouTube algorithm's door. Ultimately, though, I've made a million videos about this, and I mean, to be a little more serious, hundreds actually, but when it comes to bang for your buck, it really doesn't get much of a better deal than this. This is almost laughably cheap at how much content you're getting for how little this would cost. Which does bring us to our final two entries. So I'm going to be honest with you, I'm just going to include these despite the fact that I assume most people probably already own them, but perhaps if you want to gift them to somebody for extra cheap or something. Coming in at 75% and 80% off respectively, you can pick up Skyrim Special Edition for $10 and The Witcher 3 for $10 as well. Now, the crazy thing is, The Witcher 3 is actually all of its DLC included, which I thought was pretty crazy. But let's talk about Skyrim first. So, I am just referring to the special edition here that does not include the anniversary content, but seeing how what most people do with Skyrim is mod it anyway, and the anniversary content is primarily just adding in the Creation Club stuff, I wouldn't exactly consider it essential to the experience, to be sure, but as much as I just sort of waxed poetic almost about Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous there, Skyrim is actually my most played single-player game. I have roughly 1,000 hours in it, and that is actually largely unmodded. Some of that is modded, but the vast majority of it is not. With mods, though, you could certainly play it for thousands of hours, as many people have, as a matter of fact. So, Skyrim is simultaneously probably one of the most influential games of all time. Like, whether you like it or not, most people can pick up Skyrim, play it, and have a really good experience with it. And while if you're watching a channel like this, or even a video like this in some cases, there's probably a pretty good chance we could have a conversation about some of the things I think Skyrim does less well, especially compared to its predecessors in whatnot. It is nonetheless the case that something about Skyrim just really sort of scratches that itch for people, and it keeps you coming back to it all of these years later, which is certainly why I've played it so much. And so it's kind of just hard not to put it on a list like this. But then we have The Witcher 3. An interesting case. I've in fact played it for close to 500-ish hours. Several full playthroughs, like a full clear of all the content, would likely come in at over 100 hours for you anyway. A lot of that really comes down to just the incredible stories that the game actually takes the time to tell you. Like the opening area with, of course, the Bloody Baron, the DLCs, which are themselves phenomenal, and there's actually even rumors, I don't know how true this is going to wind up being, of some upcoming story DLC that might wind up being dropped for The Witcher 3 all these years later in anticipation for the upcoming 4th game. Which is interesting because The Witcher 3 is probably going to be the easiest point of entry for most people, but my personal favorite was actually the second game, but that one is a janky and odd mess at times, and honestly a little hard to recommend in places. But in the case of The Witcher 3, paying $10 for what is hundreds of hours worth of story content is certainly a great deal and a pretty solid way to pass the time if you don't have anything else you are interested in. So again, either you can play this for yourself for cheap, you could pick it up for cheap in order to gift it to somebody who may not have played it yet, but in either case, time has made the sales for these games incredibly cheap. So that is pretty much going to do it for this particular video. Certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. If you have any other games you want to mention in this vein, by all means, feel free to do so, but that is going to do it for me today. So thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.